Hello everyone, Steve Goodwin here with my anchor test number 153. Today we're going to look at two out-of-production anchors. First will be this 29-pound steel galvanized Barnacle anchor. It is asymmetrical, single-toothed, and pivoting fluke. I think that makes it quite unique in the world of anchors. The other is this possibly very old folding Fisherman. You can see it's very compact when it's folded up. Otherwise, it folds out into normal Fisherman anchor proportions. It's held in place via pins or bolts, and it's all very robust. Before we get to that footage, I'd like to update you about the fund drive toward the purchase of the new Rollbar Rockna Mark II anchor. Last month's video, I began this fund drive asking you folks to chip into my PayPal account. So far, I've collected just over $400, so thank you all very, very much. The promise I made was that if you put an indication that it is for the Mark II, just make a little note. If for some reason I don't buy this anchor, I just simply won't cash in or collect that money, and your money won't go to waste. But I'm pretty sure we'll get there. Just need a few $100 more, and I'll go ahead and get that anchor on order. All right. Let's get out of the water and see how these two old school anchors perform in a couple of my normal test beds. Okay, we'll start off with the Barnacle here in the clean sand seabed. The toe does dig in right away, but it really can't bury itself. And when it does start dragging and trying to bury further, we'll notice that the anchor rotates and tips up onto its side. Max hold was 285 pounds, and on the resets, it was only about 215. Fairly reliable resets, but these are very low numbers. I've tested numerous 20-pound anchors that can hold the full boat thrust of 1,325 pounds. Here in the cobblestone seabed, this 29-pound anchor was able to hold the boat with 165 pounds of pull. This contrasts with the best 21-pound anchor, which was able to hold 180 pounds. So while it is in the ballpark of the other 20-pound range anchors, it's certainly at the low end of the range. This is the what I call cobble sand seabed. It consists of roughly golf ball sized cobblestones in a thin layer on top of quite clean sand. Now the holding was the same as the cobblestone seabed. It was about 165 pounds with little to no motion. However, this seabed has the potential for the smaller anchors to develop very, very high holding numbers. The best here was the little 17-pound Mantis M2, and it made up over 1,000 pounds of hold. Okay, now we've moved over to the sandy mud seabed, and although the anchor lands and attains the correct position, we note that the fluke tip is pointed skyward, and I didn't know it at the time, but the fluke was completely fouled and unable to pivot. What I found on the top side was that a small pebble from that previous cobble sand seabed had lodged in between the pivot pin and the barrel of the fluke. That's a design flaw in my view, and we'll talk more about that on the workbench at the end of the video. So with the fluke free to pivot, the anchor does set nicely. However, it makes very marginal holding power. It's only 165 pounds before a classic mudfowl pop-out type release. The anchor could reset, but with only about half that power, and this compares very poorly to the other 20-pounders. Numerous 20-pound anchors can make over 1,000 pounds of holding here. Again, it's just another example of a fluke or anchor arrangement that does not allow for the free flow of mud past itself and subsequently no ability to keep diving. Last seabed we'll look at for the Barnacle is the soft mud at Scow Bay. It was very poor. It only held 100 pounds of thrust. It would repeat that. That's one good thing. It's no surprise given this anchor's inability to dive and remain upright, and of course also that very, very small fluke area. Both of those are going to conspire to make it a very low performer in this soft mud. I'll mention that throughout these tests, the anchor chalked, behaved, and self-launched from the bow roller without problem. Now let's move on to the folding Fisherman anchor. We'll start off here in the clean sand. So what I'm looking for here is whether or not the anchor can bury at least one of those fluke palms, and we're going to see that it cannot. The indication for it being buried fully would be when the shank of the anchor is laying down horizontally right down onto the seafloor, and what we see is the crown of the anchor, or the rear end of the shank, is still elevated very high, and I dragged it all over the place, never had any indication that it was going to be buried. And to me, that's a complete failure. The maximum hold that I saw was 165 pounds, and again, for a 45-pound anchor, that is a complete failure. Okay, now we've moved over to the sandy mud site, and it was another failure. The fluke failed to penetrate the seabed. Once again, we'll see the crown is well above the seafloor. Holding was even less than the clean sand area. It was only 135 pounds before it would just slide along the seafloor. Didn't matter if the boat motion was brought to a start, and no matter how carefully I reapplied thrust, never any indication of a set. And last test will be the folding Fisherman in the cobblestone seabed. And this is where we would hope, or at least think, that maybe the Fisherman would excel. They're known to be good in rock, but same story. It just cannot bury that fluke. The most holding I saw was 165 pounds. I dragged it for 100 feet or more, stopped and start. 165 was the best it could do. Well, in my book, both of these anchors were a failure. I had really hoped that this folding Fisherman was better. Lots of people say these are great in rock and heavy weed, but frankly, in the smaller rocks, we see that it is far worse than modern anchors. And in terms of large boulder-type rocks, my thought is that any sort of anchor would work, because they're just going to wedge in between a crack and hold you. So I think for rock, that claim should probably go away. I don't see how this is really any better. In terms of the heavy kelp, that I haven't been able to test, but frankly, I don't think anyone else has either. I don't know of anybody who has taken the latest crop of modern anchors and a Fisherman and done any kind of a test or even real-world back-to-back anchoring in kelp. So that one remains to be seen, whether a Fisherman is truly a benefit in that type of substrate. In the case of the Barnacle, the fluke could at least penetrate, but we don't get any burying, and the holding numbers were very low across the board. We've got lots of obstacles on the face of the fluke, obstacles to the free movement of substrate, and we know that that is absolutely imperative in many seabeds. If the substrate can't keep moving, it tends to clog up and form a ball, and once we have a buried ball and we pull on it, it pops out every time. You might ask, how in the world does this happen? How does an anchor manufacturer or developer come up with a design that just seems to fail so perfectly? And there's probably many possibilities. One is that the developer might be simply located in an area that has seabeds that don't clog, for example, and that would be perfectly explainable. For the case of the Barnacle, maybe it was developed where there is a really firm sand or a hard sand, and all they needed was a toe to get in and not necessarily very much in order to make good holding power. Obviously, in my area with the more softer sands and muds, the name of the game is deep burial, and this just can't do it. Even if it doesn't pop out, like in the clean sand that I tested, the anchor tends to roll and list due to its asymmetrical nature. So again, it's not a very useful anchor around here. Maybe somewhere else it would be more useful. Now, the other fundamental flaw with the Barnacle, as we saw in the testing, was the way that the fluke became jammed or stuck. And that was as a result of a small pebble that had gotten all the way down inside the barrel here. I could see it, and it took quite a bit of wiggling to get it free. And to me, that is a pretty major flaw. Other pivoting fluke anchors, such as Danforth and Fortress, I've never seen anything get jammed into their hinges, and I think that's due to the fact that the amount of metal in the circular part is just quite narrow, and there just isn't a lot of space for them to remain clogged in there. I will say that the Danforth and Fortress style anchors are more prone to fouling due to material getting jammed between the flukes and the shank. And what is different about this anchor, and better, is that the single-sided nature means that the object only has 2 points to become jammed into, whereas the Danforth and Fortress have 3. So a rock can very nicely be jammed between the 2 flukes, and then the shank forms that third surface, and it just locks it in and holds it just perfectly. So this is probably less likely to foul in the normal way with a rock or a shell jamming the shank proper, but as we saw, it perhaps is more likely to be fouled by just small sands and stones getting stuck in the pivot barrel. Okay, that's all I have for these 2 anchors. Once again, I'd like to thank the dozen or so folks who have already chipped in to that RockNA Mark II fund. Thank you very much. And perhaps an even bigger thanks to the 80 or so patrons that have been quietly every month chipping in a little bit that goes toward the general testing and production of these videos. Thank you so much. To everyone else, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. So long.